Well, our first guest today is someone I've wanted to have on this program for a long time. Al Sussman is the executive editor of Beatles Fans Magazine and the author of the book Changin' Times, 101 Days That Shaped a Generation, which looks at the period beginning with President Kennedy's assassination on November 22, 1963, right through to March 1st, 1964. Al Sussman, welcome to the show.
Hi, Ghosty. How are you?
I'm good. You know, before we get into this book, I want to talk for a moment about your role in Beatles Fans Magazine. It has been a lifeline for Beatle fans for many, many years, you know, getting exclusive information and reviews and interviews and stuff like that. And I said many years. How long has Beatle Fan been around?
Well, we just finished our 40th year, and I'm now in my 40th year with the magazine because my first piece appeared in the last issue of the first year.
Wow.
And that was in December of 1979.
And do you remember what that first article was about?
Actually, I do. It was back in those days. I was an opinionated sort, a little overly opinionated, and so for the first piece I did, it was kind of an open letter lobbying for Beatles fans to kind of become more musically liberal or musically ambitious and embrace new wave music.
Boy, so right out of the gate, you were making your presence known.
Yeah. This is true. I didn't just sort of tiptoe in. And unfortunately, that was kind of the tone with a lot of the stuff that I did in the 80s. I look back because I've been doing an archive project for the magazine the last few months, and I'm looking back on some of the stuff that I did back in the 80s, and I'm thinking, what was he going on about?
Well, I think that was of its time, you know, that Lester Bangs School of Journalism. Oh, the article's about me. I think nowadays the articles are more in an academic direction.
Yes,
yeah,
definitely.
So considering that past 40 years of writing about the Beatles and chronicling their story, would you consider yourself an historian?
Yes. If I had to describe myself, it would be a Beatles historian. You know, certainly not on the level of a Mark Lewison or a Bruce Spicer, but definitely a historian.
And I think that's evident in your book, where you document what was actually happening in the culture as opposed to the popular fiction that's grown up over the years about the Beatles' arrival in America. One of the biggest ones, that the U.S. was so despondent after the assassination of JFK. And to be clear, people were rightly depressed and shocked and alarmed, but the idea that the reason the Beatles had this seemingly overnight success when they arrived here was because Americans were in such a funk that we desperately needed cheering up. That is inaccurate.
Very inaccurate.
Yeah.
Because we're talking about basically about 6 weeks between the assassination of President Kennedy and I Want to Hold Your Hand taking off in the first week of January. And from a linear point of view, you know, from the calendar, it just doesn't work because frankly, the country, yes, for the first couple of weeks, you know, I mean, there's no doubt that was an incredible psychic wound.
Sure, yeah.
You know, no doubt about that. I'm not minimizing that at all. But the reality is that, you know, after the first couple of weeks after the assassination, once we got into December, basically people began living their lives. And in fact, Time magazine in the second week of December, the lead piece in their national news section called The Mood of the Nation, which basically, you know, said that the country was moving on and people were living their lives, and there was a Christmas season,
right.
and especially for, you know, young people for whom Kennedy was a hero, absolutely.
Right.
But young people, especially in that era, we tended to, you know, unless there was a death in our, you know, literally in our family, we tended to just kind of move on, and I was more concerned in late December with whether the Giants would beat the Chicago Bears in the NFL championship game, than being in a fetal position in mourning for President Kennedy. So it just doesn't work. And certainly by that first week in January, we had very much moved on, and then there was this incredible explosion.
And something else you point out in the book, on the very same day that President Kennedy was assassinated, the Beatles were on American television, or at least a clip of them, right? On
that morning.
The
report by Alexander Kendrick, who was the London bureau chief for CBS News, the report that he had filed appeared on the CBS Morning News and was scheduled to be on the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite that night, but obviously, the evening news was simply just folded into the nonstop coverage of the the aftermath of the assassination. But that's an interesting confluence of events that Bruce Spicer came up with. And Bruce's book, The Beatles Are Coming, is, for my money, that is the chronicle of the Beatles' breakthrough in America. In fact, I've often said that if you take that book, also the book by Candy Leonard called Beatleness, and for the historical context, my book, young people can really kind of get a grip on how this phenomenon happened, which is an amazing story.
Yeah. Those are the Beatles, those are. And this is Beatleland, formerly known as Britain, where an epidemic called Beatlemania has seized the teenage population, especially female. Some of the girls can write, and they belong to the Beatle fan club. The Beatles sound like insect life, but it's spelled B-E-A-T, beat. And these four boys from Liverpool with their dish mop hairstyles are Britain's latest musical and, in fact, sociological phenomenon. They have introduced what their press agents call the Mersey sound, after the River Mersey on which Liverpool stands. And though musicologists say it is no different than any other rock and roll, except maybe louder, it has carried the Beatles to the top of the heap. In fact, they have met royalty, and royalty is appreciative and impressed. Wherever the Beatles go, they are pursued by hordes of screaming, swinging juveniles. They and their press agents have to think up all sorts of ways to evade their adoring fans. Thousands of teenagers in every city and town stand in line all night to get tickets for their touring show. Girls faint when the tickets run out. The other night, the Beatles played Bournemouth, the South Coast family resort, and Bournemouth will never be the same. Reporter Josh Darsa talked to the Beatles in their dressing room.
What has occurred to you as to why you've succeeded?
I don't know, really. As you say, the haircuts, we didn't think they were a gimmick, but everyone else said, oh, what a gimmick.
What is the Mersey sound? How does it differ from other rock and roll and pop?
It doesn't really. It's just happened that all of a sudden hundreds of rock groups, all from Liverpool, made records, and it was a bit more like the original rock and roll than the stuff they've had over the last few months. So people decided suddenly, there's all these Liverpool groups, so they call it the Liverpool sound and the Mersey beat and everything else.
On the Nicky Cuff, all things.
Yeah, but it's just, It's just a way of classifying it, but I don't think the music's very different.
Do you have any fears that your public eventually will get tired of you and move on to a new favorite?
Well, they probably will, but,
You ever think about
depends how long it takes for them to get tired.
Yeah.
Don't it?
It's stupid to worry about things like that, because, it could...
It's not worth
could
missing your sleep for, is it?
No,
worrying. No.
It could
What do you
happen
think,
tomorrow, and it could, we could have quite a run.
We're talking to Beatles author and expert Al Sussman today on the Vintage Rock and Pop Shop. His book, Changin' Times, 101 Days That Shaped a Generation, is a good book for young people, too, because young people need to know not just what happened, but they need the context. They need why and how and who some of these people are, the major players in the Beatles story.
Mm-hmm. Trying to explain, for instance, Ed Sullivan.
Right.
Because somebody, especially younger people, they see the videotape of especially the February 9th, 64 show, and they see this round-shouldered, stiff, marble-mouthed guy, and they're thinking, this guy was the host of the most popular variety show in America, and for 23 years?
Right.
So it takes some explaining.
Right. How did this grim figure become such a beloved TV personality? And your book also points out that America was kind of in the throes of an Anglo-mania before the Beatles arrived, which kind of set the stage for our acceptance of the Fab Four. Yeah,
going back to actually the fall of '62. When Beyond the Fringe debuted on Broadway right in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of '62, and that show comes right out of the satire boom of the early '60s in England. That was kind of like our introduction to that type of humor, which by decade's end would produce Monty Python. But for instance, Anthony Newley. Was on Broadway in Stop the World, I Want to Get Off, and there were a couple of other Broadway shows. Oliver, of course, was one of them, and there were a number of other things that were going on pop culture-wise between the two countries. For instance, during '63, one of the most popular TV shows in England was That Was the Week That Was.
Right.
And there were already plans by the fall of '63 for there to be an American version of That Was the Week That Was. In fact, there was a kind of a pilot for it that ran in October of '63, and the series was scheduled to begin running in January of '64.
Right, and the Beatles coming along and sharing some of that sense of humor. The Beatles were almost like the ultimate pop culture fulfillment of this Anglomania that had been sweeping the country.
Very much so, especially because of the fact that unlike virtually any of the other bands that came out of England, they each had specific personalities.
Right.
And so, especially the girl fans, each one could have their own following.
I love them. I don't care what anybody thinks. I love the Beatles for them, and I'll always love them. Even when I'm 105 and an old grandmother, I'll love them. And Paul McCartney, if you are listening, Adrienne from Brooklyn loves you with all her heart. I love you, Paul, and please come to the window so I can just see you. I saw you smoking before, and I kissed the limousine you looked out of. But I love you, and I want you, Paul. Please look at it. And Ringo, you can look at it, too, because I like you.
Another reason why the Beatles became so popular so quickly in the U.S., they arrived here with a back catalog. They had had hits, obviously, in Great Britain in '62 and '63. They were released on small labels here in the United States before Capitol picked them up, and those songs had hung around and maybe had some success in small local areas across the country, but it just exploded in February of '64, and songs like She Loves You and Please Please Me, which had been released on small labels here in the U.S. and really didn't do anything, all of a sudden, everyone was rushing out to buy those records.
Absolutely. Yeah. During '63, and again, Bruce Spicer tells this story very well in The Beatles Are Coming, during '63, there had been these, between VJ and then Swan, they released the not Love Me Do, because that didn't actually come out here until the beginning of '64.
Right.
But the three singles after that, Please Please Me, From Me to You, and She Loves You, all were released here during '63. And other than the fact that From Me to You did reach a number 116, mostly because of the fact that Del Shannon had recorded his own version that wasn't really a hit either. Other than that, they really didn't make much of an impression at all on the charts. But on kind of a local level, there were, it got airplay on certain stations and in certain smaller markets like Worcester, Massachusetts. She Loves You and I'll Get You did actually quite well. So there was something brewing. And
Yes.
then especially in December when, talk about a confluence of events, when Marcia Albert in Silver Springs, Maryland, sees the postponed Alexander Kendrick report on the CBS Evening News on December 10th and writes to her favorite disc jockey, Carol James at WWDC in Washington. He gets a copy of I Want to Hold Your Hand and has her come up, introduce the record, and like some bad Hollywood script, the phones go crazy.
So Marcia Albert of Dublin Drive of Silver Spring has the honor of introducing something brand new, an exclusive, here at WWDC. Marcia, the microphone here on the Carol James Show is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, for the first time on the air in the United States, here are the Beatles singing I Want to Hold Your Hand.
Another myth that you see repeated in many, many rock and roll history books is the myth that there was nothing happening musically in America in 1963, so that by the time 64 rolled around, we were just starved for entertainment. And as your book points out, and a lot of the other books that you mentioned also point out, there was quite a bit happening musically in 63.
Yes. Unfortunately, we've gotten, little samples of that the last few days with the passing of Hal Blaine. And,
right.
We've gotten to hear so many of the sessions that he played on that produced hits during 63, obviously most notably Be My Baby by the Ronettes, but a number of others as well. And there was really a lot happening musically during 63. You had the girl groups, and you had obviously the Phil Spector productions, right. And Brian Wilson's work with the Beach Boys, and the folk revival that was in full throttle at that point, especially with the civil rights movement being kind of a trigger for that. And so there was really a lot going on, a lot of great R&B, out of New Orleans and out of New York. There was it was not like in say 1959 and 60 when there was a lot of novelty records and dance records and Elvis clone teen idols,
right,
that kind of thing.
And death discs, that was another thing.
Oh yeah,
right. So there was quite a bit happening musically, and I think the Beatles were not only great but just different. The records didn't sound like anybody else's records. They seemed to be louder than anybody else's records. They jumped right out of your AM speakers.
Oh yeah. In fact, I actually reacted negatively.
Oh,
to I
did
Want to
you?
Hold Your Hand when I first heard it, and I was a holdout for the first month, and they actually won me over with their performance, specifically on the second Ed Sullivan show, the one from Miami Beach.
Ah, what was it? This Boy?
This Boy was, that's probably the moment, because, I don't know, in my 14-year-old, not terribly musically sophisticated mind, John, Paul, and George gathered around the one microphone, harmonizing, and then, on the middle eight, where John really revs up, with that incredible rock and roll voice of his, and the other two just kind of falling away from the mic. I just thought that was incredibly cool. Plus the fact that they were, they weren't in a TV studio. They were on a stage in a hotel ballroom, and also very close together.
Yes.
And they were only a few months removed from playing ballrooms in England, so they were kind of in their element. And that and the sound mix, which was very much weighted toward Paul's bass and Ringo's drums, not much of a better rhythm section in all of rock and roll than that. all of that combined to finally, wear down my resistance.
Right. They won you over. So the Fest for Beatles Fans is coming up, and you are going to be there. What specifically will you be doing at the Fest for Beatles Fans?
Well, my sort of domain is what's called the Act Naturally discussion room.
Okay.
And I participate in a lot of the panel discussions and moderate Q&As with a lot of authors. Plus, also I assist Tom Frangione, the resident Beatles expert from the Fab Forum on Sirius XM,
right?
With trivia, Name That Tune, and various and sundry other things. I'm sort of all over I call myself the sort of the camp counselor for the authors, because I do a lot of the scheduling and other things. I kind of take that from Terry Hemmert, who's the MC at the Chicago Fest, and who is, or kind of calls herself Ranger Terry.
Right. So. Where could people go to get your book?
That's okay. That's a little bit of a problem.
Oh, I'm so glad we spent all this time talking about it.
Well, no, I mean it is kind of available through Amazon.
Okay.
But their supply, I'm not sure how much of a supply they have. So it might take a while. What I've been telling people is that it is available on through Amazon if you have a Kindle.
Right.
And you're into that, either the Kindle or the Kindle app on your iPad or your iPhone, whatever. It is available for the Kindle, and that you can get instantly, and it's a lot cheaper. It's about, the last time I looked, it was about $5 or $6.
Al, I want to thank you so much for coming on. This conversation's been a long time coming.
Thank you, Ghosty. I appreciate your inviting me.
And I hope you'll come back on again.
Oh, absolutely.
From the 1976 album, Wings at the Speed of Sound, that was Let 'Em In. Over the past decade or so, there's been a substantial rediscovery of the Wings catalog and Denny's role in it. But of course, Denny Laine has been making records since 1964, first as a founding member of the Moody Blues. He'll be at the Fest for Beatles Fans next weekend, where he'll perform some Moody Blues, Wings, and solo classics. Rock and Roll Hall of Famer Denny Laine, welcome to the show.
Thank you. How are you?
I'm doing good. Before we get into talking about the past, let's jump to the present for a second. Tell me about this Songs and Stories tour that you're doing.
Well, I do the band thing, but this is something else. And it's just songs that I'm associated with, mainly that I've written or co-written, during the whole Moody Blues to Wings thing, and solo stuff, and just songs and stories. So I might even throw in a few requests and stuff like that. People like it. It goes down pretty good.
Yeah, I would think. And I would also imagine that you probably perform your signature song, which is Go Now, the Bessie Banks number that you recorded with the Moody Blues. It's really the first hit in the U.S. that people would have heard your voice on. Did you discover that record over in the U.K. and thought it would be a good fit for you?
Well, yeah, in a way. I mean, we were doing that kind of stuff, but we picked that one because it had a piano intro, and we had a piano in the band. That was the old Moody Blues. And it was our style at the time. So, yeah, we had a hit with it on the Chuck Berry tour, actually. He came to England and we were on his tour. So it kind of helped, people saw us playing it live. And, that was the biggest thing ever for us. I mean, first ever.
We've already said...
It must have been a little surreal for you all these years later to get inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a member of the Moody Blues.
Yeah. You got to remember that the Brits don't do the Hall of Fame so much.
Right.
So we were very, very happy to be inducted. It's about time, really. I think for them, not just me.
Oh, yeah. No, a lot of people were saying that. Now, I don't know if you follow the reaction to the McCartney Archive series of albums, the Wings re-releases, those big box sets. I know you're involved in them, but if you read the reviews, especially of these two most recent sets, the Wings Wildlife and the Red Rose Speedway sets, it's almost as if fans, especially younger fans, are appreciating those original records more than ever before.
It's funny because I'm getting more recognition now than I've had in a few years anyway. It's something to do with the remastering as well. You know, when you remaster stuff, you can hear everything a little bit better and it's more up to date or something. Something like that.
Yeah.
But, yeah, I think people are looking at the old days and sort of seeing where it all started and being influenced by it, you know, in a good way. And there's a lot of bands out there now again, which used to be like that with us. It was all bands. So we couldn't, you know, it wasn't about recording in those days so much. It was about playing live.
A lot of people have been blown away by just how good the live material is.
It was a good lineup.
Yeah.
Cyrus, Cindy McCulloch, the original band, you know, it kind of had a little feel about it. What it was, we were just beginning in Wings. We couldn't do Beatles and we couldn't do Moody Blues stuff. We had to do something new. And that was our way of saying, this is where we're at the moment, you know. So at least we put something out.
Another song of yours that was originally meant for the double album configuration of Red Rose Speedway, but was left off, and people are calling it a highlight of the double album, which has just been released, and that's I Would Only Smile.
Are they really?
Yeah.
Well, that's good to hear.
Said this could have been a power pop single.
I mean, the thing is, that's one of the songs, obviously. When we recorded that album, we were recording a lot more stuff than we actually needed, thinking we were going to put out a double album. Now, something happened there between, you know, Paul and Glyn Johns, the producer, and we didn't end up finishing that album. So that was shelved, that song, you know, along with some other stuff that was done. I mean, and now to find out it was going to be on the reissue, it's great, you know, I'm very happy about that. So if you say that people are liking it, that I'm even more happy.
Speaking of Wings lineups, you're going to be reunited with your former guitarist, Lawrence Juber, at the Fest for Beatles Fans next weekend.
Yes, but I think Steve Holland's going to be there.
Oh, good. Well, in that case, it'll be a three-wing circus. Ba-dum-bum.
And it actually, this is the year when, you know, this is the anniversary of that big album.
Yes. So if people want to find out where you're going to be outside of the Fest for Beatles Fans next weekend in Jersey City, they can go to your Facebook page, which is facebook.com/DBF Laine.
Well, I'm going to be in the New York area. I'm doing Darrell's House, April 10th. And hang on, I'm just asking if I can talk to... What else is going on?
Are you going to be at McClune's for your solo gig?
Oh, McClune's is Asbury Park with my solo stuff. Yeah, I've got a few things going at the moment, but I've also got a musical I've had lying around for a while called Arctic Songs, an environmental piece. And I do have an album in the can that I haven't released. And there's a few things going on, you know, whereby, like, I'm probably going to Europe and around the world this year. But I haven't worked for a long time, so not really this extensively, and I'm really enjoying it, you know, get back out there with an audience, you know.
Well, I bet everyone is just as excited to see you out there. So, Denny Laine, again, can't thank you enough. Thanks for being part of the show this week.
Fantastic. Thanks very much.
Our guest this hour is a legendary record producer who either produced or engineered records for everybody from Aerosmith and Alice Cooper to The Who and Zebra. But for these purposes, we're going to concentrate on his collaboration with John Lennon on what sadly turned out to be the last studio album released in his lifetime, Double Fantasy. Jack Douglas, welcome to the show, and I'm going to tell you why I chose to open this interview with the Beatles song Help.
Okay, Ghosty.
I chose that song because before you got a chance to work with the Beatles, You embarked on a frantic, a hard day's night and help style adventure when you and a friend went off to Liverpool as kids, right?
I did on a tramp steamer, yes.
Were you going specifically to try to find the Beatles, or what was?
No. I was going. The guy that I played in a band with, named Ed Leonetti, he and I were going because we wanted to immerse ourselves in Mersey, in the Mersey beat and the Mersey sound, and go to the Cavern Club and hang out in Liverpool and just, get a taste for the whole thing. This was in 1965.
Wow.
And we were a year out of high school, and we decided that we would do that. We brought our guitars and amps. We were hoping to maybe get into a band. And that wasn't a good idea. After a terrible trip, we crossed in late November, crossing the North Atlantic at that time of the year. It's not a good idea, especially on a tin can that was probably built in the 30s.
Right.
And when we got there, immigration said, "No, you can't land because you've come here to work. Obviously, you have guitars and amps, and so." And you have no visas, and you have no return trip tickets. I mean, we were really naive, but it was the cheapest way there, $112.
Right.
So I escaped from the ship. I escaped the first night, and Eddie was afraid to do that. I thought it was crazy. I put on a disguise. I really didn't need it. It was pretty easy to walk off the ship. And I think the only preparation we had was we had a few dollars, British pound sterling, and I took a bus that said Central Liverpool, went in. First place I went was to a record store, and that was a few days after Rubber Soul had been released, and I bought it and went into a listing booth, and pretty much it cemented the fact that I would like to stay there. I went to a newspaper office. I saw it across the street from where I bought the record, and it was the Liverpool Echo. After some problems initially, because I ran in there and said, "I'm an American musician being held captive on a ship," which kind of hard to explain since I'm standing there. And then I had to explain how I escaped. And finally, I'm telling this whole story to a receptionist, by the way, who was just staring at me in disbelief. And finally, she got hold of an editor who came out and thought, this is an interesting story. But to prove the fact, he was going to drive me back to the ship. And if he saw me get back on the ship, then he was going to have every newspaper in the North and even the London papers cover the story. Thought it was a pretty good story. And I did. I went back on the ship with some fish and chips that he bought for me, and the Rubber Soul album, which we listened to the rest of the night. And sure enough, the next day, the ship was crawling with newspapers, and we were on the front pages of the Liverpool Echo and a few other newspapers, and even the London Mirror. I mean, it was like big news, and they did all kinds of promotions for us. And before the ship left, immigration came on board and said, "Listen, I don't know how you guys did this. I have no idea, how you could have possibly done this, but you're really causing a lot of problems, keeping these young musicians from making us look bad." And so they let us go on a student visa, and which we weren't students, but we weren't allowed to bring our guitars and amps in. We had to ship them back. and soon we were playing in a band, and it didn't take long for immigration to catch up to us, and we got deported in chains.
Wow.
And
this is like a movie almost.
Yeah, I mean, it was quite an adventure for an 18-year-old, and they put us on the first ship going back to New York, which was that's the United States that threw us, and we were down in steerage, and back we went. But we've been sending these press clippings back about us, and so when we got back to New York, we were kind of minor celebrities, and we got into a lot of good bands, and I had a pretty good career as a recording artist for until I decided to go into the studios.
And evidently, Lennon heard about this.
Well, what happened was I was editing, doing a lot of editing and transferring in a room for the Imagine album, which, for me was like the biggest thrill in the world that I would be working on this record. And because it was a room removed from, the main rooms where they were overdubbing and recutting tracks, he was looking for a place, I think, to get a respite from Phil Spector's madness. Mm-hmm. And so he wandered into the room I was in and sat there quietly. He was on the other side of the console and in a well kind of where there was a couch. I could just see his feet and cigarette smoke. And I told him, I'm doing all your transferring and editing, and he just kind of like, oh yeah, thank you, you did a good job. Ignoring me pretty much, just wanted to be alone and sit there. And after about 10 minutes, I got the nerve to say, I've been to Liverpool, which kind of got his curiosity, and his head popped up, and he said, really? Where are you from? I said, I'm born and raised in New York. He said, why would you want to go there? It's just kind of kind of an ugly place. Everyone there would love to come here. He said, in fact, I've just moved here. So I said, well, I was a musician, and the same thing I told you. I wanted to immerse myself in Mersey Beat, figure out how they were taking basically American music and spinning it in some way and feeding it back to us with a whole new sound. I wanted to know how. And he said, oh, okay. He said, well, how did that work out for you? I said, well, good and bad. I said, bad, I got deported. And he kind of cracked up. I said, but good, I made a lot of noise before I left. And that's when he went, one of the two crazy Yanks that were plastered over the newspapers, that was you? I said, yeah, that was me. And he even remembered on the front page of the Liverpool Echo, there was a picture they had taken on the boat. And I had my guitar. I was in my hands, and it was a 55 Les Paul custom, a rare guitar for England. And he asked me, "Do you have that Les Paul?"
So you remembered the photo. That's great.
Yeah. I said no. He said, "Boy, we cracked up so much about you. Here we're releasing an album. It should have been just us on the front pages of at least the local papers, and here are these two crazy Yanks." And we cracked up. But he was like, of all the places that I come in the world, I have to run into the crazy Yank. That was, and he thought that was like, was kind of cool. And so he invited me down to the main room where they were recording. At which point, when I walked in there, the chief engineer, looked at me and said, with a kind of a look that was like, "What are you doing in here?"
Right.
And I said, "I don't know. I'm with him." Kind of nodding over towards John, and John said, "No." He gave me a ride home after, because we both lived in the village. He invited me to start working on the record with him on the Imagine album as an engineer, and took my picture, which was on the inner sleeve, and it started a very long and great relationship with both he and Yoko. So you never know.
That was Woman from the album Double Fantasy, released in 1980, produced by our guest today, Jack Douglas. Now, I know Lennon had some time off where he really wasn't making new music, but when he decided, I guess sometime around 1979, to go back into the studio, I guess it made sense for him to contact you because he had had that fun experience with you at the record plant.
Well, the thing is, we had been in touch, and I'd been working with both he and Yoko in a number of ways during the year. In fact, even stayed with him in L.A. when he was kind of getting crazy, and drove the getaway car a number of times because I was producing Alice Cooper in Los Angeles.
Right.
But we stayed, friends, and I did a lot of Yoko stuff over that period, which John produced. then he kind of retired, and I ran into him about a year before I was contacted to do Double Fantasy. I ran into him at a health food store over on the east side near the 90th Street YMCA, and he'd been in there with Sean. Sean was getting swimming lessons. And we sat down and talked, and he was asking me, how I was doing. I said, well, I've been, really busy producing a lot of people, and so he gave me his private, and I only lived 4 blocks from him on Central Park West. Right. He gave me his private telephone number, and he said, call me and come by. And I didn't call him because I figured, I had read all the stuff about it. He was a house husband, and I didn't really want to bother him. And then a year later, I got the call, and it wasn't. In fact, we didn't record at Record Plant. We recorded at the very first Hit Factory over on the east side. We went back to, after we had finished Double Fantasy and all the material for the following album, Milk and Honey, it was all that material was recorded at the same time. But after we had finished all that, John said that he was going to Bermuda to rest before we were going to do any more work. And and about 2 weeks after he told me that, he called me up and he said, "You know what? I want to go back in the studio. I feel really energized by this whole thing, and I just want to go back to work. So let's just me and you and Yoko go into the studio." And that's when we went to Record Plant.
I see. As his producer on this album, was there a vetting process? He played you demos and you said, okay.
He sent me 4 cassettes full of material, all of which he narrated in some way or another. And he wasn't sure if any of it was any good. He asked me to call him. He was in Bermuda. And he asked me to call him and tell me what I thought. He said, listen to it for a few days and tell me what you think. It was all very primitive. He had recorded these demos on on just a Yamaha or a Panasonic blaster, that had a radio and a cassette player recorder built into it. And he just sang and played or guitar or piano into this box, and that was what the quality of these things were like. And my answer to him when I got back to him was, I don't know if I can beat this, with a real production, because it's got so much character, and I love the songs, and the primitive sound of it, I think, is just like really cool. And he just laughed and he said, "Okay, so I guess that means we're going to do this." And of course, it was a secret for months that we were making this record. So he said, just go and arrange them. So now I had to put a band together, which he wanted all his contemporaries. He wanted people that were the same age as him in the room. So if he called out some song from the 50s that he'd like to jam on for a while, they wouldn't scratch their heads. They would go ahead and jam on it. And so I put a band together. I gave him a list of all the players. So Yoko wanted to, do numerology checks on them. And of course, they all worked out to be good. And so I would go to rehearsal and rehearse with this. Well, first thing I did was I actually wrote charts for all of the songs that I had picked out for to record. And then I brought them in rehearsal, and the band, Tony Levin, Andy Newmark, Yuba Crack, and all those guys, they didn't know whose album they were making.
Ah.
It was a secret. So they would just play these songs. I would rehearse with them, and I would sing, and then I'd record the rehearsals, and then I would go back to the Dakota, go up to John's. John liked to work in bed. That's a well-known fact, and it's absolutely true. Right. So you would jump into this big bed with him that was surrounded by all kinds of gear, and pianos and guitars, you jump in bed, and then I would play back the rehearsal tape, and he would make some comments to me on what he'd like to change or edit or make faster. I'd change in any way, and then I would go back the next day to rehearsal and make those changes, and it went on like that for 2 weeks. And then the last rehearsal before the day before we were going in the studio, I told the band to meet on the corner of 72nd and Central Park West, and that we were going to rehearse in the artist's apartment. At which point I think it was suspicions confirmed for quite a few of them.
Right.
As we went into the Dakota and up to John's apartment, John Yoko's apartment, and did a kind of a dry rehearsal with him.
Wow, imagine if you had said, ladies and gentlemen, Paul Anka. That's the whole time we've been.
Well, I've worked with Paul Anka.
Well, there you go.
It wouldn't have been disappointing.
Well, a couple of quick questions regarding some of the songs on Double Fantasy. Just like Starting Over, I had heard that originally the song did not have that coda that kicks off with that drum beat. And was that pieced together from elsewhere in the track and just an afterthought added on?
No, I'm playing it.
Oh, you are? Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
On Andy's drums, which were set up, because I decided that I wanted to put a hole in it. And so, Andy Newmark will tell you it's the most famous drum fill he never played.
I see. I thought you lifted it from earlier in the song or something.
No, that fill does not exist anywhere. Boom, boom, ba-da, ba-ba-da, ba-ba-da. No, I just went out and played it. It wasn't hard to do. and then we just cut it in, but because I wanted to put a pause there, and I put in the sound effects of the being in the air terminal, World Airlines.
Is that what's being said?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, you cleared up that mystery for me. I mean, I like that choice. Where he says "fly away," and then you almost get the sense that he's taking off there. Airborne, and then you come in with the drum coda. Okay, that's you. That's good to know.
Hey, you want to talk about 50s records?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
My favorite 50s records, because I was a kid in the 50s. I came up and I was like so influenced by Buddy Holly and the Everly Brothers and Chuck Berry.
Sure.
And, everything that was happening there. But my favorite at the time were the Buchanan and Goodman Flying Saucer records.
Oh, yeah, the break-in records.
Yeah, which were totally, they never, that was first sampling, really, and totally unlicensed. And went to number one, every one of them. And they were I as a kid, would sit there because all my favorite songs would be on there, like the hooks of the songs would be on those records. I don't know if you play records, but
of course.
If you could dig those up, I think your audience.
Oh yeah, we play that
something they've
stuff.
never heard before.
I'll tell you a quick story. I don't know if you're familiar with. He's passed away recently. George Klein. He was a Memphis DJ, friend of Elvis.
Yeah. Sure.
He put together a record called "The Return of Jerry Lee." And it was a break-in record that was inspired by the Buchanan and Goodman records, and it was all about Jerry Lee Lewis's trouble. It was a big splash overseas that he was with his wife, who was his cousin, and she was underage.
Right. And who was 14.
Right, exactly. And everything on this record, it would be George Klein saying, "Jerry, how do you feel about," and then they would cut to "Great Balls of Fire" or whatever.
Yeah.
And do you know what label put that record out?
No.
Sun Records. Jerry Lee Lewis's own label put it out.
That's hilarious.
And I thought, boy, I guess they just felt, hey, it's showbiz. We can make some money off of this.
I tell you, man, when I was a kid, those record labels were so important to me. I think Specialty was one of my favorites.
Oh, sure.
And it just meant so much to see those labels spinning around on my record player.
It's an amazing thing overseas. I mean, it's not great for the artist, I know, but in overseas, the copyright laws are different, so they put out these compilations. Anything pre-62, I guess, is now part of the public domain over in Britain.
Yeah.
So they put out a lot of box sets of labels devoted, like the OK Record Story, the Laurie Record Story, and, or Roulette, and they can get away with it now. But, and they
you got to be careful with roulette.
Right, yeah. But they put them all out, and it's really fascinating to hear it's as much as I love the Beatles, and I know you're appearing at the Fest for Beatles, I'm going to be there too, everybody's going. But really, that's just a magical time. I mean, it doesn't get any better. And I always find it fascinating that, and it was the same with John. It's the same with Paul even today. When those guys want to jam, that's their whole world is that.
Yeah.
Music.
Well, let me tell you a funny story. So, John, of course, and the Beatles, to get anything on the Roulette label was just magical to them.
Right.
So, John had done this rock and roll album, and now we're all back in New York, and John comes in to say hi to me, and I'm in the control room. I can't remember what I was producing. Whatever artists I was producing were always like jaw-dropping if John would come by
to
say hi. But he came in, he said, the album is all finished. I said, it's great, John. He says, all mixed. He said, I'm going up to Morris Levy's farm over the weekend to play it for him. And I said to him, wow, that's really good, John, but let me just tell you, I have to give you a little bit of advice about Morris. I said, don't leave the tape. Be sure it was a 7.5 copy.
Right.
I said, be sure you play it for him and then take the tape and leave. So he said, why? I said, no, you just should. I wouldn't leave the tape there. It's very dangerous to leave the tape. Oh, okay. So then I saw him the following week. I said, how did Morris like the tape? And he said, we just sat around by the pool all day at the farm. He goes, I couldn't get Morris to listen to it. So, yeah. He said, so I had to leave it. The following week, it was on TV on Adam Records, which was his son's label. John Lennon sings the hits of the 50s, 60s.
Now, Adam 8 presents one of the most incredible artists of our time, John Lennon, singing 15 of the great rock and roll hits. Here's how to order.
I had read, I don't know if it had come from you, but that John would, at least on one occasion, stop what he was doing to take a phone call from Paul, and they would have a long conversation. Is that accurate?
Well, I wouldn't say he would completely stop what he was doing, but there were, he did take phone calls from Paul. Yeah, absolutely.
Do you have any idea what they were talking about? They're just
I
reminiscing.
know one thing they were talking about, and that was the plan to do Ringo's record.
Right.
Which was slated, and Ringo and I have talked about this a number of times, and I've given Ringo tapes. I call him Richard, by the way. But, the plan was, George hadn't come on yet, but the plan was for those guys to be the backup band for Ringo's record, and that was going to happen in the following year. So that was the plan.
And I know that John wanted to tour the Double Fantasy.
Yeah, absolutely. He actually designed he did the drawings for the design of what the stage looked like. It was incredible. He had all kinds of cool ideas for it. The tragedy beyond belief.
I've heard some of the session tapes, and John seems to be having the time of his life just jamming with the musicians, and they jam on, like we were talking about before, a lot of those 50s numbers.
They jammed a lot of Buddy Holly and Gene Vincent.
Right.
They jammed a lot of Beatles songs. All, early Beatles songs.
Right.
And the cool thing was when we got to mixing, I had my I had this Sony blaster that I like to mix to get an idea of what it would sound like on the radio. And if I was busy doing something else, John would turn on the radio, to the FM station,
right?
WNEW-FM. And if a Beatles song came on the radio, we would all stop and listen to it in its entirety. And then John would tell you a fascinating story about everything that happened that day around the recording of that song, which was, and it was stunning to hear the stories. It's hard for anyone that wasn't there to grasp what a different person he was from Imagine days. The anger, all that was gone. And, Jeff Emmerich and I, who I got very close to, Jeff and I used to talk about it all the time, because Jeff was always, I wish I had known that John that you knew. And
wow. So it was a lighter and more optimistic John. You can hear it in the interviews too a little bit that he's
absolutely.
Yeah, he's very, very
absolutely
positive and laid back.
Yeah, very self-satisfied, especially coming into the record with such insecurity about whether he still had it or not, to realize that he did. And I think it was after the vocal on Watching the Wheels that he said to Yoko, "Mother, you can tell him we're making a record." And I could release it to the press.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, it's all top-notch stuff. I mean, Woman, just like starting over, Watching the Wheels, it's like, wow, single. It sounds like single after single. I'm going to let you go here. I have to let you go because it sounds like you're going to be torn apart by wild dogs.
That's my dog, and it's time to take her for a walk.
There you go.
She's a great big girl.
All right, and you are going to be at the Fest for Beatles Fans.
I'll see you there, Ghosty.
Yep, and I'll see you there too. Take care.
Bye.
And thank you. Bye-bye.